Alright, listen. I saw Supergirl the night it came out, and in all honesty, I haven't thought about the movie itself all that much. It's not super complex on the face of it, and doesn't make much of an effort to challenge the viewer, blah blah, all that stuff. For a blockbuster superhero movie, it's fine. I wasn't all that impressed, frankly even a little underwhelmed the first time I saw it, but it's by no means abysmal. However, some people have been having some trouble behaving themselves, and funnily enough, that makes the movie significantly better. For this video, I want to talk about Supergirl, adapting comics, and reactionaryism. You're gonna have to indulge me on this one, it's kind of an unstructured rant, but let's just get into it. Supergirl is a mess, that's undeniable, both the character and the movie. There are a few fundamental problems with the film that are pretty difficult to ignore, namely the editing, visual identity, and commitment to its ideas. We'll get to all this in due time. A lot of the movie is just there to serve its purpose, and it does just that, what it's supposed to. The script seems to be pretty paint by numbers, so there's not much to make this movie special, but at most that makes it formulaic, messy, and a bit dull. At most. You can say a lot to criticize this movie, and I'll probably agree with you on a fair bit of it, but one of the worst comic book movies of all time, it isn't by a long shot. Supergirl happens to have found the misfortune of sitting at the cross-section of three different groups of people that all exhibit reactionary tendencies, which leads to particularly negative responses to the movie. The first, most obvious, and certainly most vocal of these groups is the misogynists. They're also by far the most annoying, toxic, harmful, whatever negative adjective you want to add here is probably right, so just go ahead and type some up in the comments. I can use the engagement. The main issue these people, if that's what we're going with, claim to have is that Millie Alcock is ugly and that the movie is woke because it's a woman superhero movie. The quality of the movie is more or less entirely irrelevant for this group of people. This was going on well before the movie aired. That's by no means the problem. There's been the usual smears, like calling it anti-men. Two women beating the shit out of a child sex trafficking ring seems pretty based and awesome to me, but then I guess that wouldn't appeal to the people and bots in question. I do want to give a small shout out to Fox News for providing the beautiful super bi headline in response to a random interview where Millie Alcock says that she thinks Kara would go both ways. Very funny stuff. Between that and the AI generated engagement bait, the usual suspects dogpiling it, whatever, this is all pretty much the point. None of these people care that bad. It really shouldn't be underestimated that more than half of internet activity is made up of bots. The people that do care are, without exaggeration, the biggest losers on the planet, or in the 12 to 16 age range, and really don't have that much effect on anything. These kinds of things are usually purposeful bait and not much else. This is kind of just one of those consequences of the current landscape. There's a serious problem of misogyny generally, but especially the profitability of bigotry is making online spaces progressively more and more uninhabitable for normal people. We've been seeing a lot of the same sentiment with Christopher Nolan's upcoming The Odyssey, though that's directed more so at Elliot Page for being trans and Lupita Nyong'o for being black. For anyone with two brain cells to rub together, this is obviously really dumb. There's not usually really any argument made as to why this is a problem. The only example there is that some people seem to be surprised that there could be black people around the Mediterranean. Very silly. And again, this doesn't hold up at all, given that Mediterranean people often don't look like Matt Damon, Anne Hathaway, or Tom Holland either. This type of backlash, just like that against Supergirl, is just reactionaryism at play. There's no real principles, there's no real problems, it's just the new thing is bad with some form of progressivism pointed at to be the cause of all the bad stuff. We saw the same with Superman being called super woke, David Cornsweat being body shamed, that Superman called weak because he started the movie at a low point. Even a movie with a white male lead set in the United States is getting this treatment. Imagine how severe it is toward women. Well, you don't have to. It's all weak bullshit, but it wouldn't have any effect if it weren't for the fact that it is incredibly profitable. Rage bait sells, and as long as that continues to be the case, this subsection of supposed fans will continue to make these spaces inhospitable for normal people until they're all that's left. Now, before we move on, I made a claim earlier that I feel the need to substantiate. I said that I feel this bigoted reaction makes the movie better, which could understandably be interpreted as contrarian, but I do think that there's something to be said there. The movie itself may be far from perfect, but without a doubt, the most important part of the movie was Supergirl and Ruthie. These characters were really given the spotlight, and that works, even if I personally wanted to see more of it. The big way in which Supergirl diverges from the first few cinematic universe female-led superhero films like Wonder Woman and Captain Marvel is that those were concerned more than anything with girl boss feminism, where the woman is cool and awesome and powerful and right, and that drives the plot. There's a lot you can say about that. Me personally, I just find it kind of boring and inauthentic. Those movies did really well at the time, and it's good that there were these female-led blockbusters, but they somewhat missed the point for me. Those movies got immense amounts of hate when they were coming out, largely because they had female leads, and I'm sure they meant a lot for a lot of people, but neither Wonder Woman or Captain Marvel were meaningful, flawed characters like their peers. Captain Marvel didn't really get any space for personal growth until The Marvels and hasn't shown up since. Wonder Woman spent 100 years hung up on some guy and proceeded to never get over it and not really grow throughout the entire DCEU, where she has the most appearances out of any character. Supergirl at least comes off as a real real person. In the type of hate directed at this movie, this just becomes a bigger and bigger deal. Those reactions further cement the movie as not particularly concerned about being seen as perfect, not hung up on a status quo or trying desperately to put women on the same playing field as their male counterparts, but just doing that. Ruthie says it literally in the film. You're not always nice, but you're kind, and you're not perfect, but you're good. This message, especially when you take into account that it's a movie about women for women, is made much more powerful by this hate mob. They're just proving the film right. The messy Supergirl thing that they're going for here serves a very clear purpose of being personable and vulnerable that's being played into by the vain comments about Millie Alcock not being pretty. That's an insane take on its own, but using it to try and dunk on a movie that has nothing to do with looks and isn't trying to have a clean aesthetic only plays into the movie's hand. Achieving perfection for others doesn't make you whole. All you can do is be good. I think that's a really nice message. And while we're vaguely on the topic, I feel like the marketing is worth mentioning because it was pretty bad. I didn't see much of anything about Supergirl leading up to it. There were a couple posters, a couple trailers, a couple TV spots. She's in Fortnite now, but nowhere near what we saw for Superman. Especially since she wears the same logo on her chest, I was expecting a lot more emphasis on the not your usual superhero bit, or going a lot harder on the feminist marketing, as that does work very well in sales and doesn't meaningfully change the amount of hate the movie will get from bigots at this point, given their prevalence and constant need to talk about the next thing. Instead, we got nothing. Now, the direction of the discourse is defined by reactionaries, and that's really never what you want, especially when the movie is underperforming financially. There's been a decently big narrative that this Supergirl is worse than the ones before, and that's why she's getting hate, as if Melissa Benoist and especially Sasha Calle didn't get huge waves of hate hurled at them when they were in the role. The current thing has to be bad. That much is true for the bigots, but even those who stick to being slightly more normal engage in the same reactionaryism. Not nearly as harmful, but still annoying and constantly negative. It may not be as overtly hateful, but it's still toxic in its own way. For Supergirl specifically, though this happens for a lot of comic book media, there's a more and more significant portion of people that are really proud to have read the original comic and find any deviation from it to be necessarily bad. This is where we have to get into specifics, because there's a really important distinction between the real issues you can have with this and made up bullshit. In comparing the comic to the movie, the first thing you immediately notice is the visual identity of the two. This is ultimately a product of them being two different genres. Woman of Tomorrow reads like a fairy tale. It leans into fantasy aesthetics to make Supergirl a mythic figure that Ruthie looks up to, and guides her in her quest to kill Krem, only to teach her that killing doesn't solve any problems, to the point where Ruthie talks Supergirl down from killing Krem. The fantasy aesthetic is important to this because we see the world from the perspective of a child under Supergirl's wing, or rather a retelling of that legend from an older Ruthie. The colors are used to contrast the pretty depressing events of the comic with a bright and imaginative landscape, darkness and light. Not just black and white, color is an important part of that light. Bilky Evely's art is very important to the story, not just because it looks pretty, but also because it informs and nuances it. Supergirl, the movie, is not the same genre and doesn't use the characters or story in the same way that the visual identity of the book emphasizes. The fairy tale element is dropped in favor of a more dirty, rough around the edges type of story. The choices in color in the film do well enough at emphasizing that. The issue here is that the choice to make it brown and gray is a bit ugly. It may minorly enhance the character arcs at play, but that doesn't mean alternatives couldn't have worked or even worked better. More than that, there's a few choices that make Supergirl not stand out and limit the movie. The colors, the look of the brigands, the Mad Max style structure, they're all pretty outdated, and that makes the movie worse or at least less unique. This is a clear-cut example of stylistic choices from the comic being better choices than what the movie does, and it makes the Guardians of the Galaxy remake allegations bear all the more weight. That being said, especially on rewatch, I don't think Supergirl looks that bad. There's a few green screens that were clearly botched, and the final action sequence especially doesn't look particularly good, but the majority of the movie looks fine. The practical aliens especially are great, and the entirety of the bus sequence was well shot. Changes from the source material are pretty disappointing when you take into account that the director, Craig Gillespie, purposefully disregarded the comic for the start of his creative process. I'm personally a proponent of making significant changes to a work when adapting it, but I do think these changes need to be interesting and good, well motivated, you know? The movie does decently well with that on the whole, but the visual identity is a big step in the wrong direction. The characters, for example, are, in my opinion, a very worthwhile change. Where the comic maintains a dynamic between Kara and Ruthie that raises Supergirl as a moral beacon, this adaptation puts them on a more level playing field, both of them beaten down by life and trying to get by without really dealing with their problems. Whichever you prefer, these are two different stories, and they should be engaged with as such. Other minor changes, like Krem being a brigand from the start, the specific kind of evil that the brigands represent, or even design stuff like Ruthie's head covering, are all largely irrelevant to the core of the story. Having a preference is normal. Decrying the entirety of the movie as bad for doing something different is a lot closer to being averse to change. Again, big difference. One issue I do have with the changes made to the movie is that a lot of it is just simplification. Krem being a brigand from the start rather than a King's agent that becomes a brigand is one of them. Same with Ruthie's entire family being killed rather than just her father, or the Green Sun sequence being so different from the Kryptonite Sun in the comics. The movie is pretty short, less than 2 hours, and I think some added complexity would have done it good and allowed for the characters to grow together more naturally, so this is disappointing. I also wish that they wouldn't have shied away from the darker elements of the story. Whether it's changes made from the comic, like Supergirl not getting shot when Krypto does, the omission of much of her story on Krypton, or even not really focusing on the child brides that were added to the story specifically for this movie, there was a lot of opportunities to get darker with it that were missed. I understand that making it an R-rated movie is probably not particularly practical, especially with Clayface also releasing this year and, they need to make money, but that doesn't keep it from feeling like something's missing. That said, this tendency to hate a piece of art, or even part of a piece of art, because a change was made compared to the source material isn't new, but due to the increasingly reactionary online environment, it has become a really big, almost normal thing. Whether it's a Spider-Man suit, anything related to Batman, or in this case, a Supergirl movie, there's a very significant amount of negativity hanging around stuff. Not because it's bad, but because it's different or new. It's easy to make fun of conservatives for having a meltdown every time a new movie comes out, but when similar behavior, again on a different scale, but similar behavior nonetheless, is exhibited by people that aren't weird in that way, this type of criticism gets ignored, downplayed, or a severe negative reaction of its own. Funnily enough, James Gunn specifically mentioned this behavior about a year ago, talking about fandom flanderization, how fans tend to latch onto specific versions of the characters, and that potentially diminishes our enjoyment of stories outside of what we expect. This is functionally the same thing as what I'm talking about here, though framed more as a disappointing tendency in fandom than a toxic tendency of online environments. The reason I'm bringing this up specifically is because this little message got an extremely negative reaction, not even because of anything in the stories themselves, but because of the supposed downplaying of the importance of Wonder Woman being made of clay, because placing it in a summary next to Batman's yellow oval and Superman's power level means James Gunn is saying that the clay origin is equally important as the chest symbol. Now obviously, if you read the post, that's not what it says, but this is just the same stuff as what we've been seeing with Supergirl. Fandom spaces online are becoming more and more reactionary, closed off to new or different ideas with little consideration for anything that deviates from their preferred norm. The difference between this current phenomenon and, say, the backlash against the Spider-Man clone saga or other instances of big deviations from the norm is that online spaces make this kind of sentiment more prevalent and more aggressive, even where the deviation is much less significant. This is not just on Twitter where you'd expect it, or in specific areas. It's happening everywhere. As long as you're engaged in online fan spaces, this behavior gets amplified through algorithms and becomes a big topic until you get to a bunch of different sides being reactionary in different directions. I'm guilty of this too, it's inescapable. There's one more example that I want to bring up, not because it perfectly extends the argument, but because I personally think it's interesting. When talking about writing the movie, Ana Nogueira mentioned that Krem dies at the end of the comic in what to her was a very striking moment that was integrated into the script for the movie from frame 1. Now, this isn't technically correct. The resolution to this whole situation in the comic is that Supergirl sends Krem to the Phantom Zone, and after decades go by, she takes him out, him having learned that he was wrong to do what he did, at least ostensibly, and Ruthie whacking him over the head with her cane. The intention here, as confirmed by the writer, is that he is still alive. So, when the writer of the movie said that she believed him to have died and that drove creative decisions in the film, the reaction was pretty rough. A big wave of pretty harsh denouncements based on a difference of interpretation. And let's be clear, this is the last page. You can tell that the intention was that he is still alive, but it's not necessarily wrong to say that she killed him here. That's also just not how art works. You can't impose an objectively correct interpretation of a scene because it's not objective. This isn't wrong to say and in no real way affects anyone reacting to it. This isn't a media literacy issue. And while we're on the topic of Nogueira, she's working on scripts for both Wonder Woman and Teen Titans, both pretty big IPs to be handing off to her, but not much is known about either yet. The reactions to Supergirl are now putting her at the forefront, catching the blame alongside James Gunn. Not the director, but the writer and the studio head. It almost goes without saying, but a writer's script is usually vastly different from what you see in the end. Changes to scripts are made in conversations between the writer and director. New drafts are made and notes are given by the studios. Hell, there's rumors of a different writer coming in and making changes to the script of this movie, but because Nogueira did a couple of interviews, she's getting the stick. At least putting Gunn on blast would make sense, given that he's the studio head. But according to people that claim to have been test screeners, there weren't particularly significant changes made to the movie, and there isn't much evidence of creative differences between Gunn and Craig Gillespie, so what gives? And that, by the way, is the third group of reactionaries here. People blasting the DCU. Realistically, one movie bombing doesn't mean that much. Overstated creative differences and studio interference do not not mean the DCU is done for. The fact that they're making a Clayface movie before a Flash movie, or Batman, or Wonder Woman, or whatever, doesn't mean that they don't care about the characters. This is really a question of slowing down a bit. At the first sign of trouble, you get 100 think pieces about the DCU being over. Chill! Now, the reason for this is obviously, again, that rage bait sells, and this gets a lot of clicks and engagement, so it gets pushed and makes money, blah blah blah. Vicious cycle, I think we all get it. There are very valid reasons to be concerned about the DCU, and studio interference is one of them. But usually, my personal preference is waiting until there's evidence. At the end of the day, Supergirl just got in the middle of a bunch of different types of discourse. The ever-pervasive superhero fatigue thing keeps coming back too, so any so-so superhero flick that underperforms is given the shaft. And yeah, when major review platforms give a low score and there's little to no marketing, a movie is gonna underperform. Or did we forget about what happened with Transformers 1? Regardless, Supergirl's fine. Don't worry about it. Go see it if you haven't, it's pretty fun. Though I don't know why you'd be watching this far into the video if you haven't seen it already, but anyway. Don't forget to hit misogynists over the head with something made out of porcelain, and have a good one.